Before we dive into this story, hit that subscribe button, smash like, and comment if you think you can handle a case that stayed hidden for 30 years, because once you enter this town, there's no turning back. The streets of Sacramento in the late 1970s seemed quiet, almost idyllic. Suburban houses lined the avenues with picket fences, neatly trimmed lawns, and children riding bicycles under the afternoon sun. But beneath that calm, a predator moved silently. He didn't make headlines immediately, there were no flashbulbs, no cameras following him. Yet by the end of that decade, the city's fear had grown invisible roots, twisting every street, every home he touched. Residents whispered about break-ins at night. Windows left unlocked. Curtains drawn tight. It was unsettling, but no one ever connected the threads. They didn't know it yet, but these small invasions were the work of a single man, an unknown, methodical assailant who would leave a legacy of terror that stretched across California. People began locking doors they had never locked before. Teenagers walked home in groups. Couples installed rudimentary alarms. They had no idea why they were suddenly afraid of their own neighborhoods. Detective Joseph Michaels had been on the force for 15 years. He'd seen burglaries, he'd seen violent crimes, but nothing prepared him for the pattern emerging in the Sacramento area. Reports of assaults, sexual violence, and home invasions arrived sporadically, disconnected by jurisdiction, location, and circumstance. At first, each case was treated in isolation. But Michaels noticed something in the reports, a signature. A familiarity in method, in timing, in the subtle way the perpetrator controlled his victims. Michaels could feel a chill every time he reviewed a new file. He pored over sketchy witness statements, sporadic photographs, and the few forensic details collected. The cases spanned multiple counties, yet the techniques matched: a flashlight left turned on, a careful disabling of locks, threats whispered in the dark, yet always gone before anyone could identify him. Each crime left a scar not just on victims, but on the community itself. Among the first confirmed victims was Karen H., a young woman in her 20s. Her home, a modest suburban bungalow, had been broken into in the dead of night. Nothing seemed missing, but Karen reported feeling watched, stalked, haunted by the shadow of someone who knew her routines. She was just one of many, each with a story more chilling than the last. The early investigations were limited by technology. Fingerprints were collected, but databases were fragmented. DNA analysis existed but was primitive, slow, and expensive. Detectives had no way to connect cases from Sacramento to Roseville, Concord, or further north. Every county thought it had a unique situation, failing to realize they were all chasing the same ghost. By the mid-1980s, the cases intensified. The attacks were not random anymore, they were calculated, controlled, and increasingly violent. Letters sent to local newspapers mocked the police, claiming knowledge of the crimes before they were reported. Public anxiety reached fever pitch. Neighborhood watches formed, parents kept children indoors, and the once trusting communities looked at each other suspiciously. The shadow of fear had cemented itself into daily life. But even as fear spread, the perpetrator remained unseen. Detectives chased leads, followed tips, and interviewed countless potential suspects. Some were brought in, questioned for days, only to be released when alibis held. The investigations were exhaustive, exhausting, and often frustrating. For every clue that appeared promising, 10 more mysteries arose. Every dead end reinforced the predator's sense of invisibility. Then came a breakthrough, a small detail, almost overlooked. In one case, a preserved semen sample from an early victim had been stored carefully, awaiting scientific progress. A young forensic analyst, Maya Ortiz, suggested testing it using a new method, DNA profiling that could link the sample to others without relying solely on suspect databases. Michaels approved it, though cautiously, understanding the stakes. The city had been waiting decades for a spark of hope. As the DNA began to be analyzed, patterns emerged, connecting the sample to previously unrelated cases. The realization hit like a lightning strike: the crimes spanning decades and counties were the work of a single man. Someone clever, meticulous, and terrifyingly consistent. Every investigator who had looked away, every overlooked report, every missed connection, it had all led to this moment. Then, just as Michaels was preparing to make a move, the lab flagged something extraordinary, a familial DNA match. It wasn't direct, not exactly. But it was enough to point to a relative, a link that had never existed in law enforcement databases before. The revelation electrified the room, because it meant the man who had terrorized California for 30 years might finally be identifiable. The detective stared at the printout, realizing what it implied. 30 years of fear, 30 years of unanswered questions, 30 years of silence, and finally, a thread that could unravel it all. He looked at the other investigators, their faces pale under the fluorescent lights. "Get ready," he said. "This is bigger than we imagined." Because when they dug into the family tree that night, tracing connections through relatives and genealogy records, they were about to uncover not just the identity of the Golden State Killer, but a truth that would shake the foundations of every community he had touched. But when they opened the first locked file tied to that family, what they found changed everything. The family tree sprawled across the conference room table like a map of secrets, lines, and dots representing generations, names, and connections that no one had thought to examine in depth. Detective Michaels traced his finger along the branches, pausing at a single cluster of relatives whose DNA could tie the Golden State Killer to living family members. Each name on that list represented decades of hidden stories, family gatherings, casual visits, all innocuous in the eyes of the world, but critical threads in the web of the killer's life. The tension in the room was palpable. One wrong move, one misstep, and the investigation could collapse, or worse, tip off the man who had remained unseen for so long. Maya Ortiz, the young analyst who had suggested the familial DNA approach, leaned over the table, her eyes sharp. "We need to verify this match," she said. "Cross-reference everything. Relatives, residences, timelines. If he's alive, he's probably still in one of these areas, or has been recently." Michaels nodded. This was no longer just a forensic puzzle, it had become a hunt through time, geography, and human behavior. The city and its surrounding counties had been living under the shadow of a phantom. Their focus shifted to Joseph D'Angelo, a name among many on the genealogical list. He wasn't unknown to law enforcement, but he had never been tied directly to any of the crimes before. D'Angelo was a former police officer, a man who had lived among those he terrorized, blending seamlessly into suburban communities. It was the perfect camouflage, familiarity breeds trust, and trust had allowed him to move undetected for decades. His past was checked and rechecked, employment records, school affiliations, residential histories. Every detail fit the chilling profile they had been assembling for years. Investigators started digging into old case files that had gone cold, now looking at them with fresh eyes and a more advanced toolkit. Reports that once seemed disparate suddenly formed a pattern. Witness statements were cross-referenced, forensic samples reanalyzed, and crime scenes virtually reconstructed. The Golden State Killer's meticulous methods, once frustratingly opaque, began to show predictability, specific times, entry methods, and victim profiles that were consistent across decades. Each revelation brought both dread and relief, the dread of the crimes themselves, the relief that they were closing in on the man who had haunted so many. Meanwhile, D'Angelo's life, unknowingly observed, revealed subtle hints. Neighbors remembered strange behaviors from years ago, late-night drives, unusual interest in other homes, occasional nervous glances during neighborhood gatherings. On paper, these incidents had seemed benign, almost trivial, but under scrutiny, they suggested control, observation, and obsession. Detectives realized that while the Golden State Killer had been careful with evidence, human behavior left trails impossible to erase entirely. The team approached the surveillance phase cautiously. For weeks, they documented patterns without alerting D'Angelo. His movements were predictable: errands, walks, visits to local businesses, occasional trips to relatives' homes. Every action, no matter how mundane, was recorded and mapped against old crimes. For the first time, the investigation was no longer about chasing shadows. The man was real, tangible, and within reach. One night, a critical breakthrough came from a retired officer who had worked on the earliest cases. He mentioned a particular car spotted near multiple crime scenes, a pattern never published or widely shared. That vehicle, combined with geolocation data and the genealogical match, pointed investigators toward a specific neighborhood in Citrus Heights. The thrill of near certainty sent adrenaline through the team. After 30 years, the puzzle pieces were finally forming a complete picture. But the tension escalated when they discovered that one of the key witnesses in the genealogical network had suddenly gone missing. Her home was empty, her phone disconnected, and her neighbors hadn't seen her in days. It wasn't coincidental. Someone knew the investigation was closing in, someone who had been hiding in plain sight for decades. Michaels understood the stakes had shifted. This was no longer a quiet surveillance operation, it was a race to prevent further manipulation, obstruction, or even escape. Detectives also began reviewing personal records, tax filings, and neighborhood histories. Every property he had lived in, every job he had held, every family he had known, each location was a potential link to unsolved crimes. They reconstructed decades of movement, overlaying it with old police reports. Each intersection, each overlooked detail, revealed a mosaic of terror that had remained invisible only because time had scattered its evidence. The breakthrough came late one evening when Maya Ortiz cross-referenced the genealogy data with a public database for the first time. A partial match linked a distant relative directly to DNA found at one of the earliest known crime scenes. The link was undeniable. The Golden State Killer's identity was emerging from decades of shadows. But the final piece of evidence, what would definitively place him at the scenes and connect him to the victims, had yet to be found. Then came the moment that would shake everyone in the department. A search of D'Angelo's old residence revealed a hidden compartment behind a closet wall. Inside, they found journals, maps, and notes meticulously detailing movements, potential targets, and personal reflections. The notes were more than clues, they were a confession written in code, a chilling insight into the mind of a man who had remained untouchable for 30 years. As they sifted through the contents, Michaels's heart pounded. Every line of handwriting was a step closer to the truth, every detail a confirmation of decades of terror. And then, tucked beneath a stack of maps, was a single photograph of a woman from one of the earliest attacks, a reminder of the lives that had been stolen and the families left shattered. The investigation had finally entered its final phase. The Golden State Killer was no longer an abstraction, no longer a phantom haunting the community. He was a man whose arrogance and meticulous planning had almost allowed him to evade justice forever. But in the darkness of that hidden compartment, surrounded by evidence that spanned 30 years, the detectives realized that what they had uncovered was only the beginning. Because one last discovery, buried deep within those journals, promised to rewrite everything they thought they knew about his crimes, and it would shock even the most seasoned investigators. When they opened it, what they found changed everything. The journals lay open on the table, each page a glimpse into a mind that had eluded justice for decades. Detective Michaels and his team moved carefully, scanning lines of handwriting, diagrams of neighborhoods, and lists of names. Every entry carried a weight, not just of terror, but of obsession. For 30 years, the Golden State Killer had mapped lives, routines, and vulnerabilities with meticulous precision. Now, each calculated move was exposed, and the detectives felt the gravity of how close they had come to never catching him at all. The breakthrough came with a single notation. Tucked between mundane observations about grocery stores and work schedules, there was a reference to a location tied to multiple unsolved assaults. The specificity was undeniable, a storage shed behind a nondescript house in Citrus Heights. It was a lead that couldn't be ignored. Officers prepared a coordinated search, aware that if they misstepped, decades of careful investigation could unravel. As the search team approached the location in the early morning fog, the air was thick with tension. They moved in quietly, weapons drawn but restrained, aware that the man they were pursuing had spent years hiding in plain sight. The shed appeared ordinary, a forgotten relic in a quiet residential street, yet every officer felt the weight of history pressing down. The door was locked, but that was only a temporary obstacle. With practiced precision, law enforcement forced the entry. Inside, the scene was chilling. Rows of shelves held binders, notebooks, and envelopes meticulously labeled. Photographs of neighborhoods, victims' homes, and surveillance sketches were neatly stacked. There were handwritten logs of potential targets, detailed observations, and maps marking escape routes. The sheer organization revealed a mind both brilliant and monstrous, disciplined and dangerous. The investigators took it all in, the silence in the shed almost deafening against the storm of years that had gone unsolved. Among the items, detectives discovered items that tied D'Angelo directly to multiple crimes: clothing, trinkets taken as trophies, and photographs confirming presence at crime scenes. It was irrefutable evidence, a tangible link connecting him to acts that had haunted communities for decades. Michaels felt a mix of relief and rage: relief that they had found the evidence, rage at the suffering endured by victims and families while this man had hidden in plain sight. D'Angelo was arrested that morning at his residence. There was no resistance, no attempt to flee. He had lived under the assumption that 30 years of anonymity would shield him, that his meticulous planning had made him untouchable. But DNA, genealogy, and persistent investigators had proven otherwise. The man who had instilled fear in communities across California was finally in custody. The trial became a national sensation. Each testimony peeled back decades of deception, each piece of evidence revealing a layer of planning, manipulation, and terror. Survivors described their fear, the long-term impact on their lives, and the emotional scars left unhealed. For prosecutors, the journals and DNA evidence were undeniable. For the public, it was proof that even the most calculated criminals could be caught. Yet the case held one final shock. As investigators combed through D'Angelo's belongings post-arrest, they uncovered letters he had written but never sent. In them, he described not just the crimes themselves, but a twisted sense of pride, an obsession with evading justice, and a cold calculation that extended to the families of his victims. The letters revealed a chilling awareness of the power he held over fear, and the lengths he would go to maintain anonymity. In the weeks that followed, California law enforcement implemented new protocols, ensuring that familial DNA analysis could be used responsibly to solve cold cases. The Golden State Killer case became a model for combining traditional detective work with modern scientific methods. Communities once paralyzed by fear slowly began to heal, though the memory of decades of terror lingered. The final revelation, however, left an indelible mark. Among the journals was a coded list, names of individuals who had been suspected, overlooked, or investigated in the early days. Some were innocent, some had unknowingly interacted with the killer. This list, never intended to be found, exposed how close investigators had come multiple times to identifying him, and how time, fear, and human error had allowed him to continue unchecked. As the courtroom emptied after the sentencing, Michaels reflected on the decades of dedication, the painstaking reviews of cold files, and the determination of analysts like Ortiz. Justice had been served, but it came at a cost. 30 years of fear, of trauma, of lives disrupted. 30 years of silence finally broken. And even as D'Angelo was led away, the final lesson remained clear: time cannot erase evidence, and the truth, no matter how deeply buried, waits for those who refuse to give up. If you thought this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it.